No one in the emergency room could explain him. Blood soaked through the torn fabric at his side, dark and steady, yet the man on the gurney never screamed, never begged, never reached out. When a nurse tried to steady his arm, he pulled away, not in fear but in control. When a doctor offered pain medication, he shook his head once. Calm, final. His eyes tracked every movement in the room. Doors, corners, reflections in the glass. "He's in shock," someone muttered, but shock didn't look back like that. Then she stepped closer, not louder, not braver, just closer. She leaned down until her mouth was near his ear and whispered 4 quiet words, words no one else could hear. The man froze. His jaw tightened. His breathing changed. For the first time since arriving, his eyes widened, not with pain but with recognition. Slowly he turned his head toward her, and in that split second of silence, everyone in the room felt it. Whatever she had just said, everything was about to change. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy stories filled with mystery, hidden honor, and moments that stop time, consider subscribing. You won't want to miss what comes next. Rain hammered the ambulance bay like gravel, the sound sharp and relentless as the rear doors swung open. Fluorescent light spilled out into the night, washing over the paramedics as they rolled the gurney forward. The man on it lay rigid, one hand pressed firmly against his right side, where blood seeped through a makeshift bandage already soaked and dark. Male, approximately mid-40s, one paramedic called out, "Found conscious near a service road off I-84. No ID, no phone, refusing most interventions." Inside the emergency room, the air was thick with noise, monitors beeping, carts, rattling, voices overlapping. But the moment the gurney crossed the threshold, something shifted. Not silence. Attention. Dr. Michael Harper glanced up from a chart and frowned. The man's posture was wrong for someone in that much pain. Shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes open sharp, scanning the ceiling tiles as if counting them. "What happened to him?" Harper asked. "Wouldn't say," the paramedic replied. "Wouldn't even tell us his name." The man didn't look at Harper when he spoke. "Because it doesn't matter." His voice was steady, not slurred, not weak. Harper raised an eyebrow. "It matters if we're going to treat you. You'll treat the wound," the man said. "That's all." They transferred him to a bed. Nurses moved efficiently, cutting away fabric, checking vitals. Blood pressure elevated but stable. Heart rate controlled. Too controlled. A young nurse tried to slide an IV into his arm. The man's hand snapped up, stopping her wrist inches from his skin. Not aggressive. Precise. "No sedatives," he said. "No narcotics." The nurse froze, startled, then glanced at Harper. "Sir, we need," I said no. Harper stepped in. "You're bleeding internally. Pain management isn't optional." The man finally turned his head and met Harper's eyes. There was no challenge there, no fear, just a kind of tired authority that didn't ask for permission. "Doc," he said quietly, "I've worked through worse." Across the room, Emily Carter stood near the supply cabinet, watching. She was new, 6 months into the ER, still learning which voices carried weight and which were just loud. Most nights she tried to blend into the rhythm of the place, to move without drawing attention. Tonight she couldn't look away. It wasn't just the man's refusal of help. It was the way he did it, the discipline in his movements, the way his breathing stayed measured, even as blood loss continued. Emily had seen panic before. She had seen bravado too. This was neither. "Emily, charge," Nurse Denise called. "Grab another pressure dressing." Emily moved, but her eyes stayed on the man. As she passed the bed, she noticed something that made her slow half a step. His boots. They were old, scuffed, civilian-looking at first glance, but the laces were tied in a specific way, tight and uniform ends tucked in. Not fashion, habit. She shook the thought away. Plenty of people tied their boots carefully. Still, when she returned with the dressing, she positioned herself on his right side, close enough to see his face clearly. His eyes flicked to her badge. Emily Carter, RN. He looked at it a second longer than necessary, then back to the ceiling. "You don't have to stay," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm assigned," she replied. He gave a faint nod. Acceptance, not gratitude. As they worked, a hospital administrator appeared near the doorway, Paul Whitman, crisp suit under a lab coat he rarely wore. He took in the scene with a practiced glance. What's the issue? Whitman asked. Patient refusing medication, Harper said. Possible internal bleeding. Whitman's lips tightened. Sir, we can't treat you properly if you won't cooperate. The man didn't answer. Whitman sighed, already irritated. If you don't consent, we'll have to document refusal and involve security. We can't have a liability situation. At the word security, the man's jaw flexed. His fingers tightened briefly against the sheets, then relaxed. Emily saw it. A flash of something buried deep, anger maybe, or memory. You don't need security, Emily said before she could stop herself. Whitman turned toward her, surprised. Excuse me. He's conscious, she continued, heart pounding. He understands the risks. We can stabilize him without escalating. Whitman studied her badge, then her face. And you are Emily Carter, she said. Nurse. Right, Whitman said flatly. Let the doctors handle it. Emily flushed and stepped back, heat creeping up her neck. She told herself to focus on the task at hand, to stay in her lane. But as the minutes passed, the man's condition began to shift. His skin grew paler. A fine sheen of sweat appeared along his hairline. Harper ordered imaging, blood work, fluids, everything except the pain meds. The man continued to refuse. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Harper said under his breath. The man's eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, he spoke so softly, only Emily heard. Harder doesn't mean wrong. Her breath caught. She adjusted the monitor leads, her hands steady despite the words echoing in her head. Harder doesn't mean wrong. A memory surfaced unbidden, her older brother standing in dress blues at a kitchen table years ago, explaining why he couldn't talk about where he was going, why some things had to stay unspoken. She glanced back at the man's side. As the dressing shifted, she caught sight of something beneath the blood and bruising. Faded ink. Lines forming a shape she couldn't fully see. A tattoo. Not decorative. Not random. Her pulse quickened. Before she could look closer, a security guard stepped into the room, summoned by Whitman's sharp gesture. That won't be necessary, the man said, opening his eyes again. His voice was calm, but the room seemed to tighten around it. The guard hesitated, uncertain why. Harper exhaled. Sir, we're trying to help you. The man looked past him, straight at Emily. You, he said. You see it, don't you? She swallowed. See what he didn't answer. Instead, he shifted slightly on the bed, a movement that sent a fresh wave of blood across the sheets. The monitors beeped faster. BP's dropping, Denise called out. Harper cursed under his breath. We're running out of time. The man closed his eyes again, breathing through the pain, every muscle in his body working to stay conscious. He knew exactly how much time he had left. He had measured worse moments by heartbeats before. Emily stared at the edge of the tattoo, at the way his fingers curled reflexively toward his side, guarding something more than a wound. Outside, somewhere above the hospital, thunder rolled low and heavy. And for the first time since he'd arrived, the man whispered something not to the doctors, not to the administrators, but to himself. Still early, he murmured. Not yet. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine, because suddenly she wasn't sure this man had come to the hospital for help at all. The trauma bay settled into a tense rhythm, the kind that made time feel elastic. Seconds stretched. Monitors ticked steadily, each beep a reminder that the man on the bed was still holding himself together by force of will alone. Dr. Harper studied the latest vitals, his brow furrowed. Hemoglobin's dropping, he said. We're losing ground. Paul Whitman folded his arms near the foot of the bed, irritation etched into every line of his posture. Then sedate him and take him to imaging. This isn't a negotiation. The man's eyes opened. No sedation, he said again. Same tone, same finality. Whitman exhaled sharply. Sir, you don't get to dictate protocol. The man turned his head just enough to look at him. I'm not dictating. I'm deciding. There was something unsettling about the exchange. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty. The kind that came from having made worse decisions under heavier consequences. Emily stood near the IV pole, pretending to review a chart while listening to every word. Her earlier embarrassment still burned in her chest, but it had been replaced by something else, now unease, mixed with a growing conviction that the room was misreading this situation entirely. Harper ran a hand through his hair. Why won't you let us help you? For a moment, the man said nothing. His gaze drifted toward the ceiling lights, then to the far corner of the room where the shadows gathered. Because help, he said slowly, comes with questions. And questions come with answers, Whitman snapped. That's how this works. A faint, humorless smile touched the man's lips. Not always. Emily caught the movement of his left hand then. As a nurse adjusted the sheet, the fabric slipped just enough to expose more of his right side. The tattoo she'd glimpsed earlier came into clearer view. It wasn't a name or a symbol meant to be seen. It was old, faded, almost to the color of scar tissue partially obscured by bruising. A series of numbers and letters arranged in a way that felt deliberate. Not a date, not coordinates. Her heart began to pound. She'd seen something like it before years ago when her brother came home on leave. He'd been careful to keep his sleeves down, but once by accident, she'd seen the ink near his ribs. He'd covered it immediately, eyes sharp, warning unspoken. You didn't ask about those markings. Emily swallowed and looked up at the man's face. His eyes were closed again, jaw clenched as another wave of pain rippled through him. He never cried out, never asked for relief. Emily Denise whispered, stepping closer. You okay? Emily nodded automatically, though her mind raced. She wanted to ask him about the tattoo, about the boots, about the way he'd reacted to the word security, but she knew better. Whatever this was, it wasn't something you dragged into the open under fluorescent lights. Whitman checked his watch. We're burning resources here, he said. If he won't cooperate, we need to document refusal and move on. That could kill him, Harper said. Whitman shrugged. Then that's his choice. The words landed heavily in the room. Emily felt a surge of anger she hadn't expected. She'd learned quickly that ER work meant hard calls and limited time, but this felt different. This felt like someone being dismissed because he didn't fit neatly into the system. The man opened his eyes again and looked straight at Whitman. You're worried about liability, he said quietly. I'm worried about timing. Timing of what Harper asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the edge of the tattoo as if checking its position. His breathing hitched for half a second, then steadied again. Emily stepped closer, her voice low. Sir, can you tell us what happened? He studied her face as if weighing something invisible. I was driving, he said. Someone didn't want me to get where I was going. That's it, Harper pressed. That's enough. Harper sighed. We need to know if this was an assault. A crash. A gunshot. The man hesitated, then nodded once. Close. Whitman scoffed. That's not an answer. The man's gaze flicked to him sharp now. It's all you're getting. A tense silence followed. Even the monitors seemed to soften their beeping as if the room itself were listening. Emily felt it again, that sense that there was more at stake here than a single patient refusing care. She thought of her brother's letters, always vague, always careful. Of the way he'd once said, half joking, if I end up in a hospital, I hope no one asks too many questions. At the time, she'd laughed. Now she wasn't laughing. Dr. Harper Denise said quietly, CT's ready, but we need consent. Harper looked at the man. If you bleed out, none of this matters. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. If I go under, he said, and don't wake up on my own terms, it matters more than you think. Emily leaned in, unable to stop herself. You're afraid of something, she said softly. He looked at her again, really looked at her as if seeing past the scrubs and badge to whatever lay beneath. I'm not afraid, he said. I'm responsible for what she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes, a subtle signal that the conversation was over. Whitman straightened. That's it, he said. I'm calling security to assist with restraint if necessary. Emily's stomach dropped. Before anyone could move, the man's eyes snapped open. No, he said. Not loud, not threatening, but the word carried weight. The security guard at the door hesitated, hand hovering near his radio. Something in the man's voice had cut through protocol and training alike. Harper raised a hand. Let's slow this down. Whitman glared at him. We don't have time to slow down. The man exhaled slowly, then turned his head toward Emily once more. His gaze was steady, searching. You said your name was Emily, he said. Yes. He nodded as if filing the information away. If it comes to it, he said, you'll know what to say. Her pulse spiked. What do you mean? His lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. You already see it. Before she could respond, a sudden alarm sounded from the monitor. Harper cursed and moved quickly to the bedside. Pressure's dropping fast, Denise said. We're losing him. The room exploded into motion. Orders barked. Gloves snapped on. The man gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body straining against the pain. Emily stood frozen for half a heartbeat, her eyes locked on the tattoo on the numbers she now recognized as more than ink. As the gurney began to move toward imaging, she leaned in close, her voice barely more than breath. "What am I supposed to say?" she whispered. The man turned his head just enough for their eyes to meet. "When the time comes," he said, "you'll remember." And as the doors to the trauma bay swung open, Emily realized with a jolt of fear and clarity that whatever those words were, they could change everything. The corridor outside imaging felt longer than it was. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow as the gurney rolled forward, wheels squeaking in rhythm with the man's labored breathing. Emily walked alongside, one hand steadying the IV line, the other gripping the edge of the bed as if contact alone might anchor him to the present. "Careful," Denise warned as they turned the corner. "BP still trending down." Dr. Harper glanced at the monitor. "We're buying minutes," he said. "That's all." The man stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, every breath measured. Sweat beaded along his temple, tracing a thin line down toward his ear. He didn't groan, didn't flinch. He rode the pain like someone who had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was counting heartbeat seconds, something invisible only he could see. They reached the CT suite. The doors slid open with a mechanical sigh, and the room swallowed them whole. Cold, sterile, impersonal. Harper began explaining the procedure, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We need to check for internal bleeding," he said. "If there's a rupture, we'll have to move fast." The man nodded once. "Do it." "No sedation?" Harper asked one last time. "No." Whitman appeared again, as if summoned by tension alone. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled impatience. "Document refusal," he said to no one in particular. "All of it." Emily felt her teeth grind together. She helped transfer the man onto the imaging table, careful not to jostle his side. As the machine began to whir, she caught sight of the tattoo again, more clearly now. The numbers weren't random. They followed a pattern she recognized from half-remembered conversations, from things her brother had never quite said out loud. Unit codes. Her chest tightened. The scan took longer than anyone liked. Harper paced near the console, eyes flicking between the screen and the patient. Denise murmured updates into a radio. Whitman checked his phone, already half distracted. Then Harper stopped pacing. "Damn it," he muttered. Emily's heart leapt. "What?" He pointed at the screen. "Liver laceration. Active bleed. We need surgery." Whitman straightened. "Then prep the ore." Harper hesitated. "He hasn't consented to anesthesia." Whitman's patience snapped. "We're past that. This is life-saving." The man spoke before Harper could respond. "No ore." Harper turned to him sharply. "You'll die without it." "Not yet," the man said. "And not like that." Emily stared at him, disbelief mixing with a strange rising dread. "Why?" she asked. "Why won't you let us help you?" His eyes found hers steady, even now. "Because if I go under," he said, "I can't control what happens next." Whitman scoffed. "This isn't a movie. No one's after you." The man didn't look at him. "You're wrong." The room fell quiet, the hum of the CT machine suddenly loud. Harper rubbed his temples. "Listen," he said carefully, "I don't know what you think is coming, but if you bleed out on my table, none of it matters." The man's lips pressed together. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face, not fear, but calculation. "How long?" he asked. Harper blinked. "How long until what?" "Until I lose consciousness." Harper glanced at the monitor. "At this rate, 10 minutes. Maybe less." The man closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Then we wait." Whitman laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "This is insane." "Get out," the man said. Whitman's smile vanished. "Excuse me. You're not needed," the man continued, voice calm but carrying an edge that made Emily's skin prickle. "You don't belong in this room." Whitman bristled. "This is my hospital." The man turned his head, slowly meeting Whitman's gaze. "Not tonight." For a moment no one spoke. Then Harper exhaled. "Paul, give us a minute." Whitman stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I am," Harper said. "If nothing else, he deserves a moment." Whitman hesitated, then stepped back, muttering under his breath as he left the room. The door slid shut, sealing them in. Emily felt the shift immediately. The air seemed heavier charged. The man's breathing grew more labored, his hand gripping the edge of the table, now knuckles white. "You don't have much time," Harper said quietly. "I know," the man replied. He turned his head toward Emily. "That's why you need to listen." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "I'm listening." He swallowed the effort visible. "There's a call that's going to come in," he said. "Not to this room, to the hospital. When it does, people are going to panic." Harper frowned. "What kind of call?" The man ignored him, eyes fixed on Emily. "They'll ask for a name," he continued. "They won't use it. They'll ask for a code." Emily's mouth went dry. What code? His breathing hitched. Pain carved lines into his face, now breaking through his control. "The one you saw." Her mind raced. "Why me?" "Because you won't misuse it," he said. "And because you already know what it means to keep quiet." She thought of her brother again. Of the silences that had stretched between them, full of things she wasn't allowed to ask. "What happens if I say it?" she asked. A faint smile touched his lips. "Everything changes." The monitor beeped faster. Denise stepped closer, concern etched into her face. "We're losing him," she said softly. Harper moved to the bedside. "We can't wait much longer." The man's eyes fluttered, then focused again with effort. "When they ask," he said, voice barely audible, "now you tell them." He paused, breath shuddering. Emily leaned in, heart in her throat. "Tell them," what he whispered, the unit code, low, precise, each character enunciated despite the pain. The sound of it sent a chill through her. It was exactly what she'd feared, exactly what she'd hoped it wasn't. "I can't say that," she whispered. "I don't have authority." He met her gaze, unwavering even now. "You have more authority than you think." The monitor alarm shrieked, suddenly sharp and urgent. "Pressure's crashing," Denise said. "He's about to pass out," Harper swore. "That's it. We're taking him to the OR." The man's hand tightened around Emily's wrist, surprisingly strong. His eyes bored into hers, desperate now, stripped of all pretense. "Promise me," he said. "Promise you won't say it until they ask." Her throat closed. "I promise." His grip loosened. Relief flickered across his face just for a second. Then his eyes rolled back, his body going slack as consciousness finally slipped away. The room erupted into motion. Orders flew. Hands moved fast. The gurney was already rolling toward the OR when the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention," a voice announced. "Incoming call for hospital administration. Priority line." Emily froze mid-step, the unit code echoing in her mind. Her promise weighed heavy on her chest. And somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The overhead announcement seemed to linger in the air long after the words had finished echoing. Priority line. Emily stood frozen just outside the OR doors as the team rushed the unconscious man inside. The heavy doors swung shut with a final hiss, sealing him away. For a brief moment, all she could hear was the thudding of her own heartbeat, loud and uneven, as if her body were still trying to catch up with what her mind already knew. Denise touched her arm. "Emily, you okay?" She nodded automatically. "Yeah, just adrenaline." Denise gave her a searching look but didn't press. "They've got him. Let's breathe for a second." Across the hall, Paul Whitman was already on his phone, his voice clipped and impatient. "Yes, this is Whitman. I'm the administrator on duty." "No, I don't know who you're talking about. We have no one by that name." Emily's stomach tightened. The call. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly, replaying the man's words in her head. "They won't ask for a name. They'll ask for a code." She could still hear the way he'd whispered it, each letter deliberate, weighted with meaning. What terrified her wasn't just that she remembered it. It was that she understood it. Whitman's voice rose. "Look, whoever you are, if this is about some patient confidentiality issue." He stopped, mid-sentence. Emily watched his face change. The irritation drained away, replaced by something sharper, something closer to fear. "Yes," Whitman said slowly. "Yes, I'm here." A pause. "No, I'm not familiar with that designation." Emily's pulse hammered. The designation, not a name. Whitman's gaze flicked down the corridor, sweeping past nurses and residents until it landed on her. He looked away just as quickly, but the moment had passed. He knew someone in this building knew more than he did. "I'll need clarification," Whitman said into the phone, forcing steadiness into his voice. "I can't release information based on..." He went silent again. When he spoke this time, his voice was lower. Understood. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at the blank screen of his phone, as if it had just delivered bad news he couldn't yet process. Denise whispered, "What's going on?" Whitman straightened, smoothing his jacket. "Nothing that concerns you." But his eyes betrayed him. They were alert now, calculating. "Where is the patient?" he asked. "In surgery," Denise replied. "Dr. Harper's operating." Whitman nodded once. "I need to make a few calls." He turned and walked briskly toward the administration offices, heels clicking sharply against the tile. Emily exhaled shakily. "Promise you won't say it until they ask." They hadn't asked her, not yet. The waiting area outside the OR filled with a tense, restless energy. Nurses spoke in hushed tones. A resident paced, scrubbing his hands together over and over. The clock on the wall seemed to move too slowly each second, stretching into something heavy and unbearable. Emily sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind replayed every detail she'd noticed, the boots, the tattoo, the way the man had reacted to the word security. None of it felt coincidental now. "Emily," Dr. Harper's voice startled her. She looked up. He'd stepped out of the OR mask, pulled down around his neck, lines of strain etched deep into his face. "How is he?" she asked. "Stable for now," Harper said. "But it's touch and go. We're controlling the bleed, but he lost a lot of blood before we got him in." Emily swallowed. "He told me something before he passed out." Harper studied her carefully. "What kind of something?" She hesitated. This was the moment she'd been trained for, and the one she'd never expected. Patient confidentiality, chain of command, all the rules that kept chaos at bay. "He said there would be a call," she said finally, "and that it would matter." Harper's brow furrowed. "A call from who I don't know," she admitted, "but it already came." Harper followed her gaze down the hall toward the now empty corridor where Whitman had disappeared. "Did he tell you anything else?" Emily's fingers tightened around each other. "He trusted me," she said, "with something important." Harper sighed, fatigue heavy in his shoulders. "Emily, if there's information that could help us treat him, it's not about treatment," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "It's about timing." Harper searched her face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I trust your judgment." The words landed with unexpected weight. Trust. The same thing the man had placed in her just minutes before. An hour passed. Then another. The OR doors opened and closed as staff rotated in and out. Emily barely moved, afraid that if she did, she might miss something. Another announcement, another call, another shift in the air that told her the moment had arrived. Finally, the overhead speakers crackled again. "Attention administration and attending staff," the voice said. "Please report to conference room B immediately." Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. Conference room B was rarely used at night. When it was, it meant something serious had happened, something that required closed doors and careful words. Denise looked at her. "That's Whitman's floor." Emily stood legs unsteady. "I should go." Denise frowned. "Why you? I don't know," Emily said honestly. "But I think I need to be there." She made her way down the corridor, every step feeling heavier than the last. Outside the conference room, she paused, hand hovering over the door handle. Voices murmured inside, low, tense, unfamiliar. She took a breath and stepped in. Whitman stood at the head of the table, flanked by two men Emily didn't recognize. They weren't hospital staff. Their posture alone gave that away too, still too aware. Whitman looked up sharply when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" Before she could answer, one of the men turned toward her. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, his expression unreadable. "Emily Carter," he said. Not a question. Her stomach clenched. "Yes." He nodded. "You were with the patient when he arrived?" "Yes." "And you spoke with him before surgery?" She hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes." The man exchanged a glance with his companion. "Did he say anything?" "Specific," Whitman cut in sharply. "She's just a nurse. She wouldn't." The man raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Emily felt the room close in around her. "Promise you won't say it until they ask." The older man met her gaze. "Did he give you a unit code?" The words seemed to echo, heavy and deliberate. Emily's pulse roared in her ears. This was it. The moment the man on the table had been counting down to. Yes, she said quietly. The room went still. What was it? The man asked. Emily drew a breath, her hands trembling just slightly as she spoke the code aloud. Every letter, every number, exactly as she'd heard it, whispered through pain and blood. The effect was immediate. The older man straightened, his expression hardening into something like awe. His companion inhaled sharply. Whitman's face drained of color. "That's not possible," Whitman whispered. The older man turned to him, eyes cold. "It's very possible. And you're going to explain to me why a patient with that designation was treated like a liability instead of a priority." Whitman opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emily stood there, heart racing as the weight of what she'd just done settled over the room. Somewhere down the hall, behind closed-door doors, a man fought for his life. And now, finally, the people who mattered knew exactly who he was. The silence in conference room B felt heavier than any shouted accusation. Emily stood where she was, hands clasped in front of her, as if the floor itself had anchored her in place. The unit code still echoed in her ears, each character now carrying a weight she could feel pressing against her chest. The older man was the first to speak. "Lock this room," he said calmly. His companion moved without hesitation, closing the door and flipping the small metal latch. The sound was soft but final. Whitman swallowed hard. "This is highly irregular." The older man turned toward him slowly. "So is letting a protected asset bleed out in your ER." Whitman's mouth opened, then closed again. A faint sheen of sweat had appeared along his hairline. "I didn't know who he was." "No," the man agreed. "You didn't bother to find out." Emily watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment, as if she'd stepped out of her own body. She had said the words. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. And yet beneath the fear there was a quiet certainty that she'd done exactly what she was supposed to do. The second man, taller, broader, his presence filling the corner of the room, looked at Emily. "Did he refuse anesthesia willingly?" "Yes," she said, repeatedly. "Did anyone attempt to override his decision?" Whitman stiffened. "We followed protocol." The taller man's gaze flicked to him sharp. "Protocol is not an excuse for incompetence." The older man turned back to Emily. "When he gave you the code, did he tell you why?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. Only that timing mattered. "And that I should wait until I was asked." The man nodded once. "That's consistent. Consistent with what Whitman demanded. With someone who knows exactly how much time he has before the world starts moving," the older man replied. A phone on the table vibrated. The taller man glanced at the screen, then looked up. "They're prepping the roof." Emily's breath caught. "The helipad, yes," he said. "And they're not using the hospital's bird." Whitman's voice cracked. "You can't just land military aircraft here." The older man fixed him with a level stare. "Watch us." The door opened briefly as a security supervisor poked his head in. "Sir, we've got activity upstairs. Unmarked personnel. They're asking for clearance." The older man didn't look away from Whitman. "Give it." The door closed again. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. The pieces were moving now, aligning in a way that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about saving a patient. This was about control who had it and who never really did. "Where is he now?" the older man asked. "In surgery," Emily said. "Dr. Harper's operating." "How long?" "Another 30 minutes, maybe more." The man nodded, already calculating. "We'll need to secure the OR floor." Whitman took a step back. "You can't shut down my hospital." The older man's tone remained calm. "I'm not shutting it down. I'm protecting it from becoming a problem." Emily felt something shift, then not in the room but inside herself. Fear gave way to clarity. The man on the table hadn't refused help out of stubbornness or pride. He'd refused it because he'd known this moment would come. He'd known exactly how much pressure his presence would apply once the right people were alerted. And he'd chosen her. "Why me?" she asked quietly, unable to hold the question back any longer. The older man turned toward her, studying her with new interest. "He requested you." She nodded. "He trusted me." A corner of the man's mouth lifted just barely. Then he chose well. Before she could ask what that meant, the door opened again, this time with purpose. Dr. Harper stepped in, mask dangling from one hand, eyes scanning the room before settling on Emily. "He's stable," Harper said. "For now. We stopped the bleed, but he lost a lot of blood. He'll need monitoring in ICU." The older man stood. He won't be going to your ICU. Harper blinked. Excuse me, he'll be transferred, the man said. As soon as he's cleared to move. Harper's jaw tightened. With all due respect, I'm the attending physician. He's not going anywhere until I say so. Emily held her breath. The older man met Harper's gaze unflinching. Doctor, he said, if he wakes up where you put him, he'll understand. If he wakes up where we put him, he'll be safe. Harper hesitated. He looked at Emily, then back at the man. And if he doesn't wake up at all, a flicker of something passed through the older man's eyes, something human, something heavy. Then we'll make sure the truth does. The room fell silent again. A sudden crackle from the radio clipped to the taller man's belt, cut through the tension. Roof is secured. Bird is inbound. ETA, 3 minutes. Emily's pulse spiked. He's not even conscious. The older man shook his head. He will be. As if on cue, Harper's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, eyes widening slightly. All reports, spontaneous movement. He's coming around. Emily's breath caught in her throat. They moved quickly then. The conference room emptied as the group headed down the corridor, their footsteps echoing against the walls. Nurses and staff flattened themselves against the edges of the hallway as the strange procession passed 2 men who didn't belong, an administrator who suddenly looked very small, and one young nurse, caught in the middle of something far larger than herself. The ore doors opened as they approached. Harper stepped inside first, then gestured Emily forward. The man lay pale against the sheets, eyes half open, breathing shallow but steady. His gaze flicked around the room, taking in faces, positions, exits. Then he saw Emily, his eyes sharpened, focusing despite the haze of pain and exhaustion. You waited, he murmured. Yes, she whispered. A faint smile touched his lips. Good. The older man stepped into his line of sight. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. No words, no gestures, just recognition. Sir, the older man said finally, we're here. The man exhaled slowly, relief threading through the breath. Took you long enough. We had to be sure, the man replied. The patient's gaze drifted upward toward the ceiling, toward the distant thump that had begun to vibrate faintly through the building. The helicopter. They'll hear that, he said. Even down here. Yes, the older man said. They will. The man's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they found Emily one last time. Next part's the hardest, he said quietly. Her heart sank. What do you mean? He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted past her toward the doors, toward the hospital that had nearly let him slip through its fingers. Outside, the rotors grew louder. And somewhere between the rising noise and the held breath of everyone in the room, Emily understood that the whisper had only been the beginning. The sound of the helicopter bled through the walls like a distant storm, low at first, then steadily louder. It wasn't the familiar rhythm of a medical transport. This was heavier, deeper, the kind of sound that pressed against the chest and made conversation instinctively drop to whispers. Emily felt it in her bones. They moved the patient with controlled urgency, hands practiced and precise, but the atmosphere had changed. Nurses who'd been brisk and efficient now glanced over their shoulders. A respiratory therapist paused, mid-step, eyes flicking upward as if she could see through concrete and steel. What's going on? Someone whispered. No one answered. Doctor. Harper walked beside the bed, his jaw set, eyes fixed forward. He hadn't argued further, not because he'd been ordered not to, but because he'd seen something in the eyes of the men who'd arrived, a seriousness that made questions feel irrelevant. The elevator doors opened, and the group stepped inside. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing them in. The helicopter's thrum grew louder as they ascended. Emily stood near the head of the bed, watching the man's face for any sign of distress. His eyes were open, now clearer than before, tracking the small digital numbers above the elevator doors as they climbed. You're awake, she said softly. Enough, he replied. How do you feel? He considered the question. Like I'm late, she frowned. Late for what? A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. For disappearing. The elevator stopped with a jolt. The doors opened onto the restricted floor leading to the roof. The air was cooler here, tinged with the faint smell of fuel and rain. 2 uniformed security officers stood rigidly at the entrance, eyes wide as they took in the scene. They straightened instinctively when the older man approached. We've been told to clear the area, one said. But, Administration. It's handled, the older man said. The officer nodded and stepped aside without another word. Emily's heart pounded as they pushed through the final set of doors and onto the roof access corridor. The sound hit her full force, now the thunder of rotor blades slicing through air, the vibration rattling the light fixtures overhead. The man on the bed exhaled slowly, a sound that almost sounded like relief. "Brings back memories," he murmured. They emerged onto the helipad. Rain whipped sideways in sharp, cold sheets, stinging exposed skin. The helicopter loomed against the dark sky, matte black, no visible markings, its lights cutting through the night like searching eyes. Crew members moved with purpose, faces hidden behind helmets and visors. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a rescue. This was an extraction. The gurney was locked into place near the aircraft. The taller man leaned close to the patient, raising his voice to be heard over the roar. "Can you stand the transfer?" The patient nodded once. "Do it." As they prepared to move him, Emily felt a sudden, sharp awareness settle over her. Every sound seemed amplified. Every movement slowed as if the world were holding its breath. She noticed it then, the hospital director, Paul Whitman, standing just inside the doorway, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his face pale under the harsh lights. "What is this?" he shouted, stepping forward. "You can't just take him. He's still under our care." The older man turned toward him, rain streaking down his coat. "Not anymore." Whitman's voice shook. "Do you have any idea what kind of scrutiny this will bring?" The patient shifted slightly on the bed, wincing as pain flared through his side. His eyes found Whitman sharp and focused despite everything. "You were worried about scrutiny earlier," he said. "That didn't stop you from threatening to call security." Whitman opened his mouth and stopped. "You didn't see a man," the patient continued, voice steady over the roar. "You saw a problem." Emily watched Whitman's shoulders sag just a fraction. "That was your mistake." One of the crew members gave a curt nod. "We're ready." As they began the transfer, Whitman took another step forward, desperation edging into his voice. "At least tell me who he is." The older man didn't answer. The patient did. He turned his head slightly, meeting Whitman's gaze one last time. "Someone you should have listened to," he said. They lifted him smoothly, efficiently, and slid him into the helicopter's open side. The interior was dim, purposeful, nothing extraneous. The door began to slide shut. Emily stood rooted to the spot rain, soaking her scrubs, her heart racing. She hadn't realized until that moment how badly she wanted him to look at her again. He did. Just before the door closed, his eyes found hers through the rain and noise. "You did good," he said. The words hit her harder than she expected. Then the door sealed, and the helicopter lifted, wind blasting outward as it rose into the night. Emily shielded her face as the aircraft climbed, its lights shrinking into the storm-dark sky until there was nothing left but rain and silence. For a moment no one moved, then the silence shattered. "What the hell just happened?" someone breathed. Whitman stood frozen, staring at the empty pad, his authority stripped bare under the open sky. The older man turned to him calmly. "An audit," he said, "and you're at the center of it." Whitman's face drained of color. "On what grounds?" "Patient rights," the man replied, "and something far more serious." Whitman laughed weakly. "This is absurd." The taller man stepped forward. "You documented refusal without assessing competency. You escalated to security without cause. You threatened restraint on a protected individual." Whitman's laugh died in his throat. "Protected," he whispered. Emily felt a chill. The word landed like a verdict. The older man glanced toward her, then back to Whitman. "And there's the matter of how your staff was treated when they raised concerns." Whitman's gaze flicked to Emily again, this time with something like fear. "She's just a nurse," he said. The older man's eyes hardened. "She's a witness." The rain began to ease, the storm retreating as suddenly as it had arrived. The helipad lights hummed softly, illuminating the wet concrete where moments ago a life had hung in the balance. Denise stepped up beside Emily, her voice low. "Are you okay, Emily?" Nodded slowly. "I think so." Denise studied her. "You sure?" Emily looked out at the empty sky, at the place where the helicopter had vanished. Her hands were still trembling, but beneath the shock something steadier had taken root. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." Behind them, the older man pulled out his phone. "Begin phase 2, he said quietly. Whitman flinched. Phase 2 of what? The man slipped the phone back into his pocket. Accountability. Emily felt the weight of the words settle over the roof, heavier than the rain, heavier even than the helicopter's shadow. And as they turned back toward the hospital, she realized the man had been right. The whisper had changed everything. But the consequences were only just beginning. The hospital felt different after the helicopter left. Not quieter, if anything, the corridors buzzed with restless energy, but heavier, as if the building itself understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Emily walked back inside with Denise's shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor rainwater, leaving a thin trail behind them. Everywhere they passed, people stared. "What was that aircraft?" someone whispered near the nurse's station. "Did you see the uniforms?" another murmured. Emily kept her eyes forward. She didn't trust herself to answer. The truth felt too large, too sharp to handle carelessly. Behind them, Paul Whitman followed at a distance, his usual confidence gone. His steps were slower, now uncertain. The crisp authority he wore like armor had cracked on the roof, exposed under rain and rotor wash. The older man and his companion moved with quiet efficiency, splitting off toward administration. 2 additional figures joined them in the corridor, men and women in plain clothes, their posture unmistakable. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Within minutes, conference room B was occupied again, this time filled with unfamiliar faces and an unmistakable sense of command. Emily was surprised when one of them stopped her. "Emily Carter," the man said. "You're requested." Her stomach tightened. Requested by who? By everyone who needs to understand what happened tonight. Denise squeezed her hand before letting go. "I'll be right outside." Emily nodded and stepped into the room. The atmosphere inside had shifted from tension to precision. Laptops were open. Phones were muted. Screens displayed timelines, call logs, internal messages. The older man stood at the head of the table, jacket removed, now sleeves rolled up. Whitman sat opposite him, rigid hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Let's continue," the older man said. "Miss Carter, please sit." Emily took a seat, acutely aware of every eye on her. "Start from the beginning," he said. "What did you observe when the patient arrived?" Emily inhaled, slowly grounding herself. He was conscious, oriented, in pain but controlled. He refused narcotics, refused sedation, refused consent for anesthesia. "Did he understand the risks?" one of the women asked. "Yes," Emily replied. He articulated them clearly. He wasn't confused. Whitman interjected, "We can't verify that." "You will not interrupt," the older man said calmly. Whitman fell silent. Emily continued. She described the boots, the scanning eyes, the reaction to the word security, the tattoo, the whisper, the promise. As she spoke, the room grew still. No one dismissed her. No one rushed her. When she finished, the older man nodded. "Thank you." He turned to Whitman. "Now, your version." Whitman cleared his throat. "We followed standard procedure. The patient was uncooperative. He refused care. We documented refusal. Did you assess competency?" the woman asked. "Yes." "Who did?" Whitman hesitated. "Dr. Harper." Harper, seated near the wall, straightened. "I assessed his mental status. He was competent." Whitman shot him a look. "You didn't say that earlier." Harper met his gaze evenly. "You didn't ask." The older man leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, you threatened to involve security." Whitman bristled. "As a precaution. Against a bleeding patient who posed no threat. He was obstructing care." "No," the older man corrected. "He was exercising autonomy." Whitman's voice rose. "And what if he had died? Who would have been responsible?" The older man's eyes hardened. "You would have been." The words landed like a gavel strike. A phone on the table buzzed. The older man glanced at it, then looked up. "He's stable," he said. "Transferred successfully." Emily exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. "Good," the man continued. "Then we proceed. Proceed with what Whitman demanded." "With the reason we came," the taller man said. "You weren't the target tonight. You were the test." Whitman's laugh was hollow. "This is absurd." The older man stood. "The patient you dismissed is a senior operator with direct oversight authority during domestic contingency operations. He was traveling under a classified mandate when he was attacked." Emily felt the room tilt slightly. He refused anesthesia, the man continued, because he was scheduled to testify within a narrow operational window. If he'd gone under before verification, his status would have been compromised. Whitman's face went ashen. Testify against who? The older man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Emily. He trusted her, he said, because she recognized discipline when others saw inconvenience. Emily swallowed hard. He whispered a unit code, the man continued, addressing the room. A fail-safe. A way to identify himself without revealing his name, and he was correct to do so. Whitman's voice was barely audible. You're saying this was all intentional? Yes, the man replied. And necessary. The woman at the table turned her screen toward Whitman. We've reviewed your internal communications. The way your staff's concerns were dismissed. The language you used. Whitman stared at the screen. His own words stared back at him. Liability risk. Escalate if necessary. Document refusal and move on. This isn't about one patient, the older man said. It's about a pattern. Whitman pushed back from the table. You can't do this. I run this hospital. The taller man stood as well. Not anymore. Silence fell. You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, the older man said, pending a full investigation. Whitman's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support. There was none. You made a choice tonight, the older man continued. You chose convenience over care, authority over listening. He turned, slightly gesturing toward Emily. She chose differently. Whitman's gaze snapped to her resentment and disbelief mingling. She broke protocol. She upheld ethics, the woman said. Whitman's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. What happens now? The older man's voice was calm, final. Now, we ensure this never happens again. Outside the conference room, the hospital continued its nightly rhythm patients, arriving monitors beeping lives, balancing on thin lines of chance and skill. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Emily stood slowly as the meeting drew to a close, legs unsteady. The older man approached her. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, he said quietly. I just listened, she replied. He nodded. That's rarer than it should be. As she stepped back into the corridor, Denise was waiting, eyes wide. What did they say? Emily took a breath. That it matters how we see people. Denise smiled faintly. Looks like you were right to speak up. Emily glanced down the hall toward the elevators, toward the sky beyond the roof she couldn't see anymore. Somewhere out there, a man with blood on his hands and secrets in his bones was alive because she'd whispered when others shouted. And as the night pressed on, the hospital slowly began to understand what it meant to be truly watched. The conference room emptied in stages, the plainclothes officials leaving first, their movements quiet and deliberate. Laptops snapped shut. Phones disappeared into pockets. What had been spoken inside those walls would not be repeated casually, if at all. Emily stepped back into the corridor, her legs heavy, her thoughts even heavier. Denise fell into step beside her without speaking, sensing that questions could wait. Around them, the ER continued to function, but the tone had shifted. Conversations were hushed. Eyes followed Emily a little longer than before. Word hadn't spread, but something had. They reached the nurse's station just as Dr. Harper emerged from the ICU wing, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He spotted Emily and stopped. They moved him, he said. Emily's chest tightened. Is he okay? Yes, Harper replied. Stable. Sedated now by his own consent once the transfer team confirmed identity clearance. Identity, Denise echoed softly. Harper nodded once. He asked about you. Emily's heart skipped. What did he say? He wanted to make sure you weren't in trouble. The words hit her harder than anything else that night. She let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He's not worried about himself, Harper added quietly. That should tell you something. Before Emily could respond, a ripple moved through the hallway, subtle but unmistakable. Staff straightened. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A man in a dark uniform stepped out of the elevator, followed by two others. Their presence didn't announce itself loudly, but it carried weight, the kind that bent a room without touching it. The first man was older, his hair silver at the temples, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete confidence. The insignia on his collar was small, almost understated, but unmistakable to those who knew. A general. Emily felt Denise's fingers tighten around her arm. They stopped at the nurse's station. "Dr. Harper," the general said, extending a hand. "Thank you for your work tonight." Harper accepted the handshake, clearly startled. "Of course, sir." The general turned his attention to Emily. His gaze was sharp but not unkind, evaluating. "You must be Emily Carter." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. He nodded. "I wanted to thank you personally." "For," she began. "For seeing what others didn't," he said, "and for knowing when to speak and when not to." Denise's eyes widened. Harper looked between them, piecing things together. The general gestured toward the ICU wing. "May we?" Emily nodded and led the way. As they walked, staff pressed themselves discreetly against the walls, eyes wide. No one stopped them. No one questioned. Inside the ICU room, the hum of machines was steady, almost soothing. The man lay still now, lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, but the tension that had clung to him earlier was gone. The general stepped closer to the bed and rested a hand briefly on the rail. "He's out of surgery, out of danger," he said quietly. "He'll recover." Emily swallowed. "Who is he?" The general looked at her for a long moment, considering. Then he nodded as if coming to a decision. "His name won't be in any report you'll see," he said. "But you deserve to understand the scope of what you stepped into." He turned slightly, ensuring the door was closed. "He's a senior field commander," the general continued. "Former special operations, currently embedded in a joint oversight task force that reports directly to the top." Emily's breath caught. "He was en route to deliver testimony tied to an internal investigation," the general said. "One that involves compromised logistics, misused authority, and people who assumed they were untouchable," Denise whispered, "and someone tried to stop him." "Yes," the general said. "The attack wasn't random. It was meant to delay him just long enough." Emily glanced at the man's unconscious face. "That's why he refused anesthesia." The general nodded. If he'd been rendered unconscious before verification, his chain of custody would have been disrupted, his testimony delayed, possibly lost. "And the unit code," Emily said softly. "That was his proof. His failsafe," the general confirmed. "A way to identify himself without compromising classified information. Only a handful of people know those codes. Fewer still would recognize them." Emily felt a chill. "My brother," she murmured before she could stop herself. The general's gaze sharpened. "Your brother served." "Yes," she said. He had a tattoo like that. He never talked about it." The general nodded slowly. "Then you understand why he trusted you." Emily's throat tightened. The general straightened and turned to Dr. Harper. "The hospital will receive formal notice regarding tonight's events. There will be reviews. Changes." Harper nodded. "And Whitman." The general's expression hardened. His authority ended the moment he chose intimidation over care. That investigation will move forward. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. Emily looked at the man on the bed again, seeing him differently now, not just as a patient, not just as a soldier, but as someone who had carried too much for too long. "Will he remember?" she asked. "What happened here?" The general smiled faintly. "He remembers everything. That's part of the burden." As if on cue, the man's fingers twitched. His brow furrowed slightly. A quiet sound escaped his throat as he shifted, fighting his way back toward consciousness. Emily stepped closer instinctively. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening. He took in the room, the machines, the faces, the general without surprise. "Guess I missed the quiet part," he murmured hoarsely. The general chuckled softly. "You always do." The man's gaze moved until it found Emily. It lingered there, steady despite the fog of medication. "You kept your word," he said. "Yes," she replied. They asked. He nodded, once satisfied. "Good." He glanced at the general. "Did it work?" The general's expression turned serious. "Yes. And because of you, it worked in time." A faint exhale left the man's chest, something like relief. He closed his eyes again, the tension finally draining from his body. As the room settled, Emily felt the full weight of the night press in on her, not fear this time, but understanding. The whisper hadn't just changed how others saw him. It had changed how she saw herself. And as she stood there between the quiet hum of machines and the unspoken gravity of everything that had been set in motion, Emily realized that justice didn't always arrive with noise or recognition. Sometimes it arrived as 4 quiet words spoken at exactly the right moment. Morning crept into the hospital in pale layers, the kind of grey dawn that made fluorescent lights feel harsher by contrast. Emily hadn't gone home. Neither had most of the night staff. Sleep felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful, as if leaving would mean abandoning the gravity of what had unfolded. The ICU remained guarded quietly, professionally. No one said the word military, but everyone felt it. 2 unfamiliar men stood near the entrance, hands folded, eyes alert. They didn't interfere. They didn't need to. Emily stood at the nurse's station when Paul Whitman reappeared. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. His suit jacket was gone, tie, loosened hair, still damp from rain or sweat. The confidence that once radiated from him had thinned to something brittle. "Emily," he said. She turned slowly. Denise stiffened beside her. "Yes," Emily replied. Whitman gestured toward a quiet alcove off the main corridor. "I need to speak with you." Emily hesitated, then nodded. She followed him a few steps away, keeping her posture neutral. "This didn't have to go this far," Whitman said, lowering his voice. "You could have come to me." "I did," Emily replied evenly. "You told me to stay in my lane." Whitman winced. "I was under pressure." "So was he," Emily said. "And you threatened to call security on him." Whitman exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how hospitals work at this level." Emily met his gaze. "I understand how people work." For a moment, Whitman looked as though he might argue. Then something in his expression shifted, not anger, but calculation. "They're overreacting," he said. "These reviews, these investigations, they'll settle down. And when they do, I'll still be here." Emily said nothing. Whitman leaned in slightly. "I can make sure this doesn't affect you. Your record, your future." The implication hung heavy between them. Denise took a step forward, but Emily lifted a hand, gently stopping her. "I don't need protection," Emily said. "I needed you to listen." Whitman's jaw tightened. "Be careful," he warned. "People who think they're heroes often end up alone." Emily's voice remained calm. "People who ignore warnings usually end up exposed." Whitman stared at her, then turned away abruptly, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Denise let out a breath. "That was something." Emily nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "It's not over." She was right. By mid-morning, the hospital's board representatives arrived, 2 women and a man, all impeccably dressed, all carrying tablets loaded with data. They moved directly into administration offices, followed by the same plainclothes officials from the night before. Meetings began behind closed doors. Staff were called in one by one. Not interrogations, conversations. Questions asked carefully, answers recorded meticulously. Patterns emerged. Not just from last night, but from months before. Emily was asked to speak again. This time she wasn't alone. Dr. Harper sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding. Denise waited just outside the door, arms crossed, eyes fierce. Emily told the same story. She didn't embellish. She didn't soften it either. She spoke about autonomy, about listening, about what happened when power chose speed over humanity. When she finished, one of the board members nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "That took courage." "I wasn't trying to be brave," Emily replied. "I was trying to do my job." Sometimes, the woman said, that's the same thing. Hours later, an announcement went out, not over the speakers, but through official channels. Paul Whitman was formally suspended pending investigation. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some staff exchanged quiet looks of relief. Others whispered nervously. A few looked stunned. Whitman emerged from the administration wing shortly after, flanked by security, not hospital security this time, but external compliance officers. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He walked past the nurse's station without looking at Emily. But she felt his gaze anyway. The hospital settled into a strange calm after that, like the quiet after a storm when debris still litters the ground but the sky has cleared. Emily finally stepped into the ICU again. The man lay awake now, propped slightly upright, color returning slowly to his face. The lines of pain were still there, but softened, controlled. He turned his head when she entered. Morning, he said hoarsely. She smiled faintly. You're supposed to be resting. Couldn't, he replied. Too much noise in my head. She pulled a chair closer to the bed. They're holding him accountable. He nodded, unsurprised. Good. Your testimony, will you still give it? Yes, he said. Soon. She studied him for a moment. They tried to stop you. Yes. Will they try again? A pause. Then, maybe. Emily's chest tightened. And you still won't tell me your name. He smiled slightly. Names complicate things. She returned the smile. So do secrets. He considered that. True. Silence stretched between them, comfortable now. You didn't have to do what you did, he said finally. I did, she replied, because someone taught me that silence isn't the same as neutrality. He looked at her with something like pride. Your brother? Yes, he nodded once. Good man. Emily swallowed hard. A knock sounded at the door. The general stepped in his presence, commanding as ever. It's time, he said. The man sighed, a mix of resignation and resolve. Figures. He looked at Emily. You changed the timeline. I just whispered, she said. He shook his head. You chose to. As they prepared to move him, Emily stood and stepped back, suddenly unsure where she fit in all of this now. The general paused beside her. There will be reports, he said. Commendations. Emily shook her head. I don't need them. He studied her. That's why they matter. The gurney rolled out quiet and purposeful, headed toward whatever waited beyond the hospital walls. Emily watched until it disappeared around the corner. Justice was moving now. Slowly, carefully. Unstoppable once set in motion. And for the first time since the night began, Emily felt something close to peace. The hospital changed in ways that weren't announced. There was no ribbon cutting, no press release celebrating reform. But over the next few days, Emily felt it in the small things, the way supervisors paused before dismissing a concern, the way doctors asked nurses for input instead of instructions, the way the word security stopped being used as a threat and returned to being a last resort. Paul Whitman's office stayed dark. A temporary administrator took his place, a woman with steel-gray hair and a reputation for listening longer than she spoke. Her first act wasn't to issue new rules, but to walk the floors. She introduced herself to night shift nurses by first name. She asked residents what scared them most about making mistakes. She asked custodial staff what they noticed when no one else was looking. People noticed that. Emily noticed too. She was restocking supplies when Dr. Harper approached a thin folder tucked under his arm. He looked tired but lighter somehow. They closed the initial findings, he said quietly. Emily paused. And they're not pretty, he replied. For Whitman. Or for a few others. Emily exhaled slowly. Good. Harper studied her. You know there was a time when speaking up like you did would have ended a career. I know, Emily said. That's why I was afraid. And you did it anyway. She shrugged. Someone had to. Harper nodded. Turns out a lot of people were waiting for that someone. Word spread not as gossip but as reassurance. Nurses stopped pulling Emily aside to whisper questions. Instead, they asked openly. Residents began inviting her into conversations she'd never been included in before. None of it felt like praise. It felt like recalibration. She returned to the ICU later that afternoon. The room where the man had lain was empty now. Sheets changed, machines silent. The space felt oddly larger without him, as if something essential had passed through and left a vacuum behind. Emily stood there longer than necessary, her thoughts drifting back to his steady gaze, the way he'd measured time not in minutes, but in consequences. You won't see him again, Denise said gently from the doorway. Emily turned. I know. Denise smiled faintly. You okay with that? Emily considered the question. I think I am. Denise leaned against the doorframe. You did something important. I did what I could, Emily replied. That's the part people forget, Denise said. That what you can is usually enough. As Emily left the ICU, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She frowned. Few people had her number outside of work. The message was short, unmarked. He made it. Her heart skipped. She typed back before she could overthink it. I'm glad. A moment passed. Then another message appeared. They listened. Emily closed her eyes, a rush of relief washing over her. Good. The reply came a few seconds later. They always do. Eventually. She didn't respond after that. She didn't need to. That evening, the hospital board held a closed session. Emily wasn't there, but she felt the ripples from it anyway. New protocols were drafted. Patient autonomy guidelines were reinforced. Escalation pathways were rewritten to prioritize de-escalation. And quietly, without ceremony, a commendation was placed in Emily's personnel file. Not for heroism, for judgment. A week later, Emily was called into the temporary administrator's office. The woman looked up from her desk and smiled. "I won't keep you long," she said. "I just wanted to say this in person." Emily sat, hands folded in her lap. "You reminded this institution of something it nearly forgot," the administrator continued. "That authority is meaningless without humility." Emily nodded, unsure what to say. "There's an opening," the woman added. "Clinical ethics liaison. It's new. Part-time at first." Emily's eyes widened. "Me, yes," the administrator said. "You listen well, and you don't confuse silence with agreement." Emily felt the weight of the offer settle in. "I'll think about it." "I hope you do," the woman replied. That night, Emily drove home under a sky washed clean by rain. The city lights blurred softly through her windshield. For the first time in days, the tension in her shoulders eased. At home, she pulled out an old photo from a drawer, her and her brother on a sunlit porch years ago. He was in uniform. She was laughing at something he'd said. She thought of the tattoo she'd seen on the man's side, of the way recognition had flickered between them without words. "Thank you," she whispered to both of them. Her phone buzzed once more. Tomorrow, the message read. "Testimony." Emily stared at the screen. "You'll be okay," she typed. The reply came slower this time. "So will you." She set the phone down and sat back, letting the quiet fill the room. Justice, she had learned, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with applause or sirens. It moved forward because someone chose to notice, chose to speak, chose to listen when others didn't. And sometimes it moved because a man who refused everyone's help trusted a woman brave enough to whisper the right words at the right moment. Outside, the night settled gently over the city. Inside the hospital, the work continued, changed, recalibrated, more careful than before. And somewhere beyond, both the final pieces were falling into place. Tomorrow would decide everything. The morning of the testimony arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no headlines, just a pale sky and a city moving through another ordinary day, unaware of how close it had come to something far worse. Emily was already awake when the sun broke through the clouds, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. She hadn't slept much, not from fear but from anticipation. At the hospital, the atmosphere was subdued but alert. The temporary administrator's presence had become routine now, her calm authority settling into the building like a steady pulse. Staff nodded to Emily as she passed, not with reverence but with something closer to respect. The kind that came from shared experience rather than hierarchy. Emily checked in at the nurse's station, then paused. She didn't need to go to the ICU today. Instead, she walked to the small chapel, tucked away near the east wing. It was usually empty at this hour, a quiet place meant for reflection rather than answers. She sat in the back pew, hands folded loosely, and let the silence work on her. She thought of the man's face the first time she'd seen him, controlled, guarded, refusing help, not because he didn't need it, but because he couldn't afford the wrong kind. She thought of how close he'd come to losing consciousness before the right people knew who he was, and she thought of how easily he could have been dismissed. Across town, in a secured federal building, the man sat upright at a long table, dressed in plain clothes that did nothing to diminish his presence. His injuries were still fresh bandages hidden beneath fabric, but his posture was steady, composed. The room was full. Investigators, oversight officials, legal counsel, faces that had once appeared only in sealed briefings now sat in open view. Recording devices blinked red, capturing every word. "Please state your designation," one of the officials said. The man inhaled once deeply. Then he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. He laid out timelines, names, decisions that had been made quietly justified as necessary, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. He spoke of compromised supply chains of authority wielded without accountability, of people who believed themselves untouchable because no one had ever forced them to explain themselves. As he spoke, notes were taken. Glances were exchanged. Phones vibrated discreetly as messages were sent and received. The machinery of justice began to move, not quickly but decisively. Back at the hospital, Emily returned to her shift. A young patient cried as an IV was placed. An elderly man joked weakly with a nurse about hospital food. Life continued fragile and stubborn as ever. Midway through the afternoon, Denise leaned across the counter. "You hear anything?" Emily shook her head. "Not yet." Denise smiled. "Whatever happens, you did your part." Emily nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on a quiet room, far away, on words being spoken that couldn't be taken back. When her phone buzzed, she felt it immediately. One message. "It's done." Her chest tightened. "How did it go?" she typed. The reply took longer this time. They didn't interrupt. Emily closed her eyes, a slow smile spreading across her face. She knew what that meant. In rooms like that, silence wasn't absence, it was acknowledgement. "I'm glad," she wrote. The dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. "You should know," the message finally read. "What you did didn't just save time. It saved people who will never know your name." Emily swallowed hard. "That's okay," she replied. "They don't need to." Her shift ended just after sunset. As she walked out of the hospital, the sky burned orange and gold, the last light reflecting off the helipad railing above. She paused for a moment, looking up at the empty pad. No helicopter this time, just wind. She thought of the first night again, of rain, of rotors, of a whisper that had turned the world slightly on its axis. At home, Emily changed into comfortable clothes and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. Her phone remained silent now. The story had moved beyond her reach, carried forward by systems larger than any one person, and that was as it should be. The next morning, news broke quietly. A federal inquiry announced. Several officials placed on leave. Contracts suspended pending review. No names released yet, but enough confirmation to send a ripple through institutions that had grown complacent. At the hospital, a brief email followed. "We are committed to restoring trust, transparency, and accountability." Emily read it once, then closed her laptop. Trust wasn't restored with emails. It was restored in moments. In listening. In restraint. In knowing when a whisper mattered more than an order. A week later, Emily stood once more in the ICU hallway, not as a nurse this time, but as an observer. A new patient argued softly with a resident, insisting he didn't need pain medication. Emily watched the exchange unfold differently now. The resident listened, asked questions, adjusted. Progress wasn't loud, but it was real. That evening, her phone buzzed one last time. "I'm disappearing again," the message read. "For a while." Emily smiled softly. "Take care." The reply came almost immediately. "You already did." She set the phone down and let the quiet settle around her. The man who had refused everyone's help had gotten what he needed, not because he demanded it, but because someone recognized the weight behind his silence. And the woman who had whispered his unit code returned to her life changed, not because she'd sought recognition, but because she'd chosen integrity when it mattered most. The hospital lights dimmed as night fell, and somewhere between those walls and the unseen places where justice continued, its slow work balance had been restored quietly, deliberately, and for once in time. Some of the most important moments in life don't arrive with applause or authority. They arrive in silence when someone is hurting, misunderstood, or dismissed, and all the world seems too busy to notice. It's easy to assume that power always announces itself, that truth demands volume, that justice requires force. But sometimes the real turning point is a choice made quietly to listen, instead of label, to respect, instead of control, to act with integrity, even when no one is watching. The man in this story survived because he held on to his honor. The woman changed everything because she trusted her instincts and her conscience. Neither sought recognition, neither needed it. And that's the lesson. You don't have to outrank someone to matter. You don't have to shout to be heard. And you don't have to be certain of the outcome to do what's right. If this story moved, you share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you believe quiet courage still matters in this world, consider subscribing. More stories like this are on the way.